When you look at a map of, a modern war zone, there's always this expectation of clear, visible boundaries.
Right, like a chessboard.
Exactly. You imagine a chessboard. You've got the invading army positioned in one province, the defending army entrenched in another, and some general can point at a screen and declare exactly where the front line is drawn.
Yeah, it's very quantifiable. A border or not a border.
Right. It feels quantifiable.
That's right.
But you step into the ancient geopolitics of the Near East, and that map just vanishes entirely.
Completely vanishing.
Because we find ourselves looking at this multidimensional conflict where the most brutal battles are, frankly, terrifyingly invisible.
Yeah, we are looking at the absolute definition of spiritual, psychological, and physical warfare overlapping so completely that you just can't separate the political strategy from the theological crisis.
You really can't. And that brings us to the core of our deep dive today, which is 2 Kings chapter 18.
It's such a heavy text.
It is. We are jumping into one of the most historically dense and spiritually profound texts in ancient literature. We're going to unpack this verse-by-verse collision between three absolute forces. First, you have the righteous reformations of Judah's King Hezekiah.
Right.
Then you have the terminal catastrophic collapse of the northern kingdom of Israel.
Which is just a horrific event.
Yeah, totally. And then third, the terrifying psychological siege engine of the Assyrian world empire.
And to really get the full picture, we can't just stick to 2 Kings 18.
Right, we have to pull in other sources.
Exactly. We have to weave in the parallel accounts from Isaiah chapters 36 and 37 and 2 Chronicles chapters 29 through 32.
Because those give us the missing historical and prophetic layers, right?
Yeah, reading 2 Kings 18 in isolation only gives you part of the picture.
Yeah.
When you synthesize it with Isaiah and Chronicles, you realize you're witnessing one of the great dramas of human history.
It really is. It's like a political case study on appeasement and a psychological portrait of a leader under unimaginable pressure.
And a theological treatise on what happens when a nation's foundational beliefs are tested by an existential threat.
So if you were listening to this, you are about to step into a world of colliding empires, toppling idols, and one of the most chilling acts of psychological warfare ever recorded.
It's intense.
It is. Think of this deep dive as a political thriller combined with a spiritual survival guide.
I like that.
Because whether you are facing overwhelming personal odds right now, or you're navigating a corporate or cultural environment that feels totally antagonistic to your core values.
Or you're just fascinated by ancient military strategy.
Exactly. This text holds a mirror up to the modern soul. It forces you to ask how you respond when the physical evidence surrounding you screams that you have been completely abandoned.
But before we get to that crisis, we have to remember that geography is just dirt and rocks without the people ruling it.
Right.
The reason this ancient map becomes a bloodbath is due to a tragic civil war that divided the region long before the Assyrians ever showed up on the horizon.
Yeah, to understand the crisis King Hezekiah faces in this chapter, we have to look back at the architecture of a fractured nation.
We have to rewind about 200 years before Hezekiah takes the throne.
Back to roughly 930 BC, right?
Yeah, right around then. At that point, the United Kingdom of Israel had reached its absolute golden age.
I mean, they had military dominance under King David.
And then unprecedented economic and cultural prosperity under his son, King Solomon.
They were a superpower in their own right. But the moment Solomon dies, the entire empire just shatters.
It shatters completely. The fracture happens under Solomon's son, Rehoboam.
And it was such an avoidable disaster.
Totally avoidable. When Rehoboam ascends to the throne, the northern tribes approach him with a very reasonable petition.
They asked for some tax relief, basically.
Yeah, they ask for relief from the heavy taxation and forced labor that Solomon had instituted to build all his massive architectural projects.
Right, because Solomon built a lot.
He did. So Rehoboam consults with the older, experienced advisors.
And what do they tell him?
They tell him to serve the people, and the people will serve him forever.
Good advice.
Great advice. But he ignores them. He chooses the advice of his young, arrogant peers. And he actually promises to rule with a heavier hand than his father.
He literally says something like, "My little finger will be thicker than my father's waist."
Yeah, it's incredibly arrogant. He chooses arrogance over service, and it triggers an immediate secession.
The nation splits into two distinct competing kingdoms right there.
The northern 10 tribes break away to form their own nation.
While the southern 2 tribes, primarily Judah and Benjamin, remain loyal to the lineage of David down in the south.
So we have this massive schism, and reading the sources for this deep dive can get incredibly confusing because these two new nations are called by several different names depending on which prophet or historian is writing.
Yeah, I was getting a bit turned around myself. Let's break that down. Let's start with the Northern Kingdom.
Okay, so the Northern Kingdom is commonly referred to as Israel.
Which is confusing because that used to be the name of the United Nations.
Exactly. But the prophets, like Hosea and Isaiah, frequently call the North Ephraim.
Why?
They use that term because the tribe of Ephraim quickly became the dominant political and military force within that northern coalition.
Ah, okay. Makes sense.
You'll also see it called Samaria, which was the capital city built a bit later by a northern king named Omri.
Right. And occasionally it's referred to as the House of Joseph, tracing back to Ephraim's lineage.
Exactly. Now, the spiritual track record of this northern kingdom is staggering.
It's just a story of unbroken apostasy.
Unbroken. From their very first king, Jeroboam I, all the way to their last king, Hoshea.
19 consecutive kings over about 2 centuries.
And the biblical text does not give a single one of them a positive review.
Not one. The completely institutionalized idolatry.
Jeroboam literally commissions 2 golden calves and sets them up at the northern and southern borders of his new kingdom.
At the cities of Dan and Bethel.
Right. And we have to look at the mechanism behind that decision.
Because it wasn't just, like, a religious whim.
No, Jeroboam was not acting out of pure religious zeal. He was acting out of political paranoia.
He recognized a massive vulnerability in his new kingdom.
Yeah, the central location for the worship of Yahweh was the temple, and that was located in Jerusalem, the capital of the rival southern kingdom.
So he's thinking, if my citizens keep traveling down to Jerusalem for all these mandatory yearly religious festivals,
their loyalties will eventually revert to the house of David, and they'll assassinate him.
So he creates a convenient, localized, state-sponsored religion just to keep his citizens inside his borders.
He essentially weaponizes convenience.
Wow. Weaponizes convenience. That's a great way to put it.
He tells the people, "It is too much for you to travel all the way up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt."
He actually takes the foundational narratives of their salvation and just attaches it to a completely fabricated idolatrous system.
And that singular political maneuver sets the DNA for the entire northern kingdom.
It's like a poison pill.
It is. They eventually adopt full Canaanite Baal worship. They integrate deeply with pagan empires through strategic marriages, and they fundamentally corrupt their national identity.
Meanwhile, down in the south, the southern kingdom retains the name Judah after its primary tribe.
Or Jerusalem, after its capital.
You also see it referred to as the House of David, reflecting the covenant God made back in 2 Samuel chapter 7.
Right, the promise that David's royal line would endure.
And spiritually, it's frequently called Zion.
Zion represents the sacred hill, the dwelling place of God, and the covenant community.
So how did the south do, spiritually speaking?
The South fares marginally better than the North, but the standard is incredibly low.
Yeah, out of their 20 kings, I think 8 received some level of commendation for trying to follow the Lord.
But only 2 kings, Hezekiah, who we are examining today, and a later king named Josiah, receive unqualified praise for their reforms.
Which is wild because the southern kingdom had a massive advantage. They possessed the actual temple, the authentic priesthood, and the original Mosaic covenant.
Yeah. Yet they were perpetually seduced by the competing cultures around them.
I was thinking about this, and I picture this entire dynamic like a massive family business started by Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Okay, I like where this is going.
So the business grows for generations. It becomes this absolute corporate titan under David, and it peaks under Solomon.
Right.
And then the division under Rehoboam is essentially a hostile corporate split.
That's a perfect analogy.
The northern branch, Ephraim, takes the vast majority of the workforce in the territory, but they immediately go rogue.
They install a new board of directors.
Exactly. The golden calves. They entirely abandon the original corporate charter of the Mosaic law.
And the southern branch, Judah, retains the original headquarters in Jerusalem.
They keep the original branding, but the executives keep secretly adopting the corrupt business practices of their pagan competitors.
That framework really helps clarify the profound stakes of the prophetic warnings we read in the sources.
Yeah, because they're not just complaining about bad behavior.
Exactly. When an ancient prophet stands in the streets and cries out to Ephraim or Zion, they are not merely shouting at a demographic region or citing a zip code.
They're addressing the spiritual identity of a people.
Ephraim becomes synonymous with a people who have substituted the authentic presence of the living God for a convenient, state-manufactured religion designed to serve political power.
And Zion remains the ideal of the covenant community, the place where God chose to put his name, even when the actual citizens of Jerusalem are completely failing to live up to that identity.
So with that geopolitical map in our minds, we turn to the opening verses of 2 Kings 18.
And like we said, the spiritual trajectory of these ancient nations almost always mirrors the character of the man sitting on the throne.
We are introduced to our protagonist, King Hezekiah of Judah.
But you cannot truly comprehend the magnitude of Hezekiah's reforms without looking at the absolute darkness of the administration that preceded him.
We have to talk about his father, King Ahaz.
Ahaz, he is just a nightmare.
Ahaz is the shadow against which Hezekiah's light is measured. Ahaz did not merely tolerate corruption, he enthusiastically imported it.
During his reign, the southern kingdom faced intense military pressure.
Wow. Particularly from a coalition between the northern kingdom of Israel and the nation of Aram. This is often called the Syro-Ephraimite War.
So the north and Aram teamed up against him.
Exactly. And Ahaz looked at these looming threats, and he looked at the rising superpower of Assyria on the horizon, and he basically concluded that the God of Israel was insufficient to protect him.
And the sources outline a reign of terror under Ahaz. He fully embraces idolatry.
But he goes way beyond just setting up statues.
He participates in the most horrific elements of Canaanite religion. He literally sacrifices his own children in the fire to the false god Molech.
Just think about the psychological devastation of growing up in a royal household where your own father is feeding your siblings to a bronze furnace to secure political favor.
It's unthinkable. It's child abuse on a national scale.
It is the ultimate expression of fear manifesting as spiritual capitulation. Ahaz attempts to buy protection by adopting the gods of the nations he fears.
Which brings us to that wild story in 2 Kings chapter 16.
Oh, yeah. Ahaz travels to Damascus to meet the king of Assyria, Tiglath-Pileser III.
To essentially surrender Judah as a vassal state.
Right. And while he's in Damascus, Ahaz sees this impressive pagan altar.
And what does he do? He sends the architectural blueprints back to the priest in Jerusalem and commands him to build an exact replica.
He outsources his theology to the empire that is threatening to conquer him.
It's pathetic. He replaces the bronze altar of Yahweh with a replica of an Assyrian altar.
It's a visual, architectural declaration of his submission to the empire.
Because to accept Assyrian protection, you had to accept Assyrian gods.
Exactly. And Ahaz's capitulation culminates in the unthinkable. He physically boards up the doors of the temple in Jerusalem.
He extinguishes the lamps. He shuts down the worship of Yahweh entirely.
He literally nails the church doors shut.
That is the environment in which Hezekiah is raised. A father who murders his children, imports foreign altars, and vandalizes the sacred heritage of his own people.
And yet, in verse 2 of chapter 18, we read that Hezekiah is 25 years old when he begins to reign. His mother's name is Abi.
And then verse 5 delivers this breathtaking summary of his character. It says, "He trusted in the Lord God of Israel, so that after him was none like him among all the kings of Judah, nor any that were before him, for he clave to the Lord and departed not from following him."
The author of Kings elevates Hezekiah to a singular status there.
I mean, David is usually the historical standard for righteous kingship in the biblical narrative.
But the text explicitly states that Hezekiah's trust was unmatched.
The sources mention that the original Hebrew text uses 3 highly specific verbs to describe the anatomy of his faith: patash, davak, and losar.
Let's break those down because they're fascinating.
Yeah, what does that actually look like in practice for a 25-year-old king?
Well, patash translates to trust or reliance. It describes an internal posture of complete confidence, literally leaning one's full weight upon something.
Okay, so total reliance.
Then davak is translated as clave or held fast. This is a word of profound relational intimacy.
It's the same word used in Genesis.
Exactly. It's the exact same verb used in Genesis chapter 2 when it says, "A man shall leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife."
Wow. So it implies an inseparable adhesive bond.
And then losar simply means he departed not, pointing to his enduring obedience over the span of time.
So he didn't just have a momentary emotional experience. He established a lifelong trajectory of faithfulness.
But how is that mathematically possible? We are talking about a young man who comes out of profound, institutionalized generational trauma.
He watched his father desecrate the nation and murder his siblings.
How does someone emerge from a childhood defined by the fires of Molech and the locked doors of the temple to become the greatest spiritual reformer in Judah's history?
It really challenges every modern assumption we have about environmental determinism.
It forces a confrontation with the reality of moral agency. The narrative of Hezekiah stands as a monumental testament to the fact that sinful heritage does not guarantee a sinful destiny.
Right. A righteous leader can arise from an utterly depraved environment.
Hezekiah breaks the generational curse not through gradual, incremental self-improvement, but through a radical, definitive choice to realign himself with the covenant of Moses.
He looks at the ruin his earthly father created and actively chooses the path of his heavenly Father.
It demonstrates the power of individual choice when it is empowered by divine grace.
So while Hezekiah is ascending to the throne in the south and choosing the path of life, the northern kingdom is hurtling toward its absolute doom under their final king, Hoshea.
Hoshea makes a fatal geopolitical miscalculation.
He had been paying heavy tribute money to the Assyrian Empire to keep them from invading, right?
Right. But Hoshea decides to rebel. He stops paying the protection money and tries to form a secret alliance with the king of Egypt to back him up.
Which introduces the looming shadow of the Assyrian war machine.
And to understand the terror that dominates the rest of this chapter, you must understand the nature of the Assyrian Empire.
They were terrifying. At this point in history, under kings like Shalmaneser V and eventually Sennacherib, Assyria was the undisputed apex predator of the Near East.
They had developed military logistics and siege technologies that the world had never seen before.
But their true power lay in their mastery of psychological warfare.
The historical records and the stone reliefs archaeologists have uncovered from Assyrian palaces are stomach-turning.
They bragged about their cruelty.
They didn't just conquer cities, they made horrific examples out of them. They left records of skinning captive leaders alive and draping their skins over the city walls.
They impaled their enemies on stakes, lining the roads to terrify anyone thinking of rebelling.
Because they understood that a terrified enemy is an easily defeated enemy.
But their most effective long-term strategy for maintaining their vast empire was demographic engineering.
This is crucial. When the Assyrians conquered a region, they did not just occupy it and collect taxes. They engaged in mass deportation.
They uprooted the surviving population, marched them hundreds of miles across the empire, and resettled them in foreign lands.
Then they took people from other conquered territories and moved them into the newly emptied land.
It's the deliberate destruction of a nation's soul.
Exactly. If you take a people away from their ancestral lands, separate them from their religious sites, and mix them with foreigners.
Within a generation or two, they lose their language, their culture, and their identity. They literally forget who they are.
The goal was total assimilation into the Assyrian machine.
And from a theological perspective, the king of Assyria viewed Yahweh, the God of Israel, as nothing more than another localized tribal deity waiting to be crushed under his chariot wheels.
He had defeated the gods of dozens of other nations. He assumed Jerusalem's God would be no different.
This is the meat grinder that is revving up just over the horizon as Hezekiah takes power.
But because Hezekiah has made this radical internal choice for God, his external actions are immediate and explosive.
Verses 3 through 8 detail his massive reform campaign. And he doesn't ease the nation into a new direction.
No, he takes a sledgehammer to the status quo.
We see a timeless principle here, right? True internal spiritual revival inevitably produces massive social and political disruption.
When a leader returns to a foundation of ultimate truth, the corrupt power structures built on lies cannot stand.
Hezekiah doesn't simply change his personal prayer life. He systematically dismantles the architecture of idolatry that his father built across the entire nation.
The text tells us he removes the high places, smashes the sacred stones, and cuts down the Asherah poles.
And these were not just harmless decorative statues in public parks.
No, the high places were localized, unauthorized shrines scattered across the countryside. Even when previous kings tried to follow God, they often left the high places intact because the people liked the convenience of worshiping near their homes rather than traveling to Jerusalem.
But Hezekiah refuses to compromise on that.
And the Asherah poles were wooden symbols dedicated to the Canaanite mother goddess, Asherah.
They were the centerpieces of fertility cults that involved highly immoral, ritualized sexual practices that had completely infiltrated the culture of Judah.
Hezekiah brings the entire system down.
He also launches military campaigns. Verse 8 notes that he defeated the Philistines, striking them as far as Gaza.
The Philistines were the historic, generational enemies of Israel. They represented worldly opposition to the covenant identity of God's people.
By pushing them back, Hezekiah is reclaiming the physical territory that had been lost through his father Ahaz's weakness and compromise. He is securing the borders.
But the most shocking element of Hezekiah's reform happens in verse 4, regarding an object from within his own religious heritage.
He destroys a holy relic built by Moses himself.
He breaks in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made because the children of Israel had been burning incense to it.
He calls it Nehushtan. And this detail completely stopped me in my tracks when I was looking through the sources.
It's a jarring moment.
Yeah. Smashing a pagan fertility pole makes perfect sense. Defeating the Philistines makes sense, but the bronze serpent was a sacred artifact. God himself commanded its creation.
So how does a leader justify destroying a genuinely good thing that God used for salvation?
Right. We have to dive into the history of this object to grasp the magnitude of what Hezekiah does here.
The story originates hundreds of years earlier, back in Numbers chapter 21.
The Israelites were wandering in the wilderness, and they fell into deep rebellion against God and against Moses.
As a severe judgment, God allowed venomous serpents to enter the camp, and many people were dying.
The people repented and begged Moses to intervene.
So God instructed Moses to forge a serpent out of bronze, mount it on a pole, and raise it up.
The promise was simple. Anyone who was bitten, if they merely looked at the bronze serpent, would live.
It was a literal mechanism of divine grace. They didn't have to perform a ritual, they just had to look in faith, and they were healed.
And its theological significance is monumental. Jesus Christ himself references this exact event in the Gospel of John chapter 3.
Right. He tells Nicodemus, "And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have eternal life."
The bronze serpent was a direct foreshadowing of the cross. It symbolized the judgment of sin placed upon a substitute and healing granted through a look of faith.
So if it has that kind of pedigree, if it was touched by Moses and foreshadows Jesus, why on earth is Hezekiah smashing it to pieces and calling it Nehushtan?
Because fallen humanity is prone to a very specific kind of spiritual amnesia.
Over the centuries, the people of Judah had taken a sacred symbol and mutated it into a toxic idol.
They had forgotten the God who provided the healing and had begun to worship the instrument of the healing.
They were burning incense to the bronze object itself.
Hezekiah recognized a profound and subtle danger. Religion without a living relationship rapidly degrades into idolatry.
They were worshiping the method of their past deliverance rather than the creator who delivered them.
Precisely. And Hezekiah calls it Nehushtan, which translates roughly to a mere piece of brass.
He strips away the mystical aura that people had projected onto it and exposes it for what it is, inanimate metal.
The principle here is crucial for any era, When the means of grace become the object of worship, they must be destroyed.
The cross itself must never replace Christ. A method of prayer, a particular building, a beloved tradition. If any of these good things eclipse the living God, they have become a Nehushtan.
Hezekiah had the spiritual discernment to realize that this historical relic, despite its glorious past, had become a stumbling block to the authentic worship of Yahweh in the present.
And that takes a staggering amount of courage.
Because he's not just fighting the external pagan culture, he's confronting the deeply entrenched, nostalgic religious culture of his own people.
People hate it when you touch their traditions, but Hezekiah cleans house.
But while Hezekiah is orchestrating this massive spiritual cleanup in the south, the bill finally comes due for the northern kingdom.
Verses 9 through 12 detail the horrific fall of Samaria, and the contrast between Hezekiah's revival and Hoshea's ruin is terrifying.
In Hezekiah's 4th year on the throne, which correlates to the 7th year of King Hoshea in the north, the Assyrian king, Shalmaneser V, marches his army against Samaria, the northern capital.
He lays siege to the city. And a siege in the ancient world was an exercise in protracted psychological and physical torture.
It wasn't a swift battle on an open field.
No, the Assyrians would surround the city, cut off all supply lines, poison or redirect the water sources, and simply wait.
They forced the inhabitants to slowly starve.
The goal was to squeeze the life out of the city until desperation drove them to surrender or madness.
The sources describe sieges lasting for months, but Samaria holds out for 3 brutal years.
3 years of starvation, disease, and the constant deafening noise of the Assyrian war machine building siege ramps outside the walls.
Finally, in Hezekiah's 6th year, Samaria falls. The Assyrians breach the walls.
And they execute their signature strategy. They deport the 10 northern tribes.
They drag them away to Hala, to the river Heber, and to the cities of the Medes.
The northern kingdom of Israel is violently erased from the map, never to return as a coherent national entity.
And the author of 2 Kings is deliberate in explaining the root cause of this catastrophe.
Verse 12 explicitly states that this was not merely a failure of military logistics, a lack of troops, or a poorly executed geopolitical alliance with Egypt.
It was a covenantal failure. The text says, "Because they obeyed not the voice of the Lord their God, but transgressed his covenant and all that Moses the servant of the Lord commanded, and would not hear them nor do them."
God had not abandoned them without warning. For generations, he sent the most powerful prophets in biblical history.
Elijah called down fire from heaven. Elisha performed miracles.
Hosea lived out a painful metaphor of God's love for an unfaithful wife. Amos preached social justice and impending doom.
God practically exhausted every avenue of communication to wake them up.
God is incredibly patient, but his patience is not infinite. When a people fundamentally reject the architecture of reality, which is the covenant of their creator, the resulting collapse is inevitable.
The destruction of Samaria was the severe mercy of divine judgment, removing a completely corrupted system.
So put yourself in the shoes of a young King Hezekiah. Imagine standing on your balcony in Jerusalem, looking north.
You have just smashed the idols. You have reopened the temple doors. You are seeking God with all your heart.
And then you receive the intelligence reports that the Assyrian superpower has just annihilated your northern neighbors.
They erased half of the descendants of Abraham from the earth.
And now the largest, most sadistic army in the known world is slowly turning its gaze toward Jerusalem.
What does that do to the psychology of a 20-something-year-old leader?
It introduces an existential terror that tests the very foundation of the faith he just proclaimed.
Because in verses 13 through 16, that theoretical terror becomes an immediate physical reality.
In the 14th year of Hezekiah's reign, the new king of Assyria, Sennacherib, launches a massive invasion of Judah.
The destruction of the north brings the meat grinder directly to Judah's doorstep.
And this brings up a very hard truth for anyone trying to live a faithful life. Righteousness does not exempt believers from attack.
Hezekiah was a righteous king, leading a massive spiritual revival, but Judah still faced the consequences of their geopolitical location and the spiritual warfare inherent in their identity.
Sennacherib sweeps through the countryside, systematically capturing all the fortified cities of Judah.
The archaeological and historical records surrounding this campaign are incredibly detailed.
Yeah, Sennacherib laid siege to Lachish, which was the second most important city in Judah.
Lachish was a massive, heavily fortified garrison that guarded the primary valley approach to Jerusalem. If Lachish fell, Jerusalem was completely exposed.
And Lachish does fall. The Assyrians actually carved massive stone reliefs depicting the siege of Lachish to decorate Sennacherib's palace in Nineveh.
They show the siege ramps, the battering rams, and the horrific executions of the Judean defenders.
When Lachish falls, the psychological blow to Jerusalem must have been catastrophic.
Sennacherib even sets up his royal headquarters in the ruins of Lachish to accept the surrender of the surrounding towns. He effectively traps Hezekiah in Jerusalem.
And it is at this exact moment, facing the total annihilation of his people, hearing the reports of the flaying and the deportations, that Hezekiah's faith fractures.
He panics. Despite the three verbs of his unmatched trust we read about earlier, he breaks.
In verse 14, he sends a message to the king of Assyria at Lachish saying, "I have offended, return from me. That which thou puttest on me will I bear."
The sources emphasize that this is a political apology, not a moral confession.
He's saying, I made a mistake by rebelling against your empire. Name your price and I will pay it. He attempts to buy peace.
Hezekiah abandons his reliance on God and attempts to manage the crisis using the tools of the world.
He leans on political compromise and financial appeasement. And Sennacherib demands a staggering ransom, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold.
To pay this extortion, Hezekiah empties the royal treasury. He empties the silver out of the house of the Lord.
And when that isn't enough, he commits an act of desperate vandalism against his own life's work.
Verse 16 says Hezekiah cut off the gold from the doors of the temple of the Lord and from the pillars which he himself had overlaid, and gave it to the king of Assyria.
Just consider the tragedy of that action. Early in his reign, he had labored to repair the damage his father Ahaz had done.
He had restored the beauty and the sanctity of the temple.
And now, paralyzed by fear, he strips the gold off the very doors he had reopened, handing the sacred wealth of Yahweh to a pagan tyrant.
Parallel scriptures in Isaiah chapters 30 and 31 revealed that the temptation went even deeper than financial appeasement.
During this crisis, the political advisors in Judah were desperately pushing Hezekiah to form a military alliance with Egypt.
They wanted Egyptian chariots to save them from Assyrian battering rams.
Assyria correctly identifies the folly of that strategy. They mock Egypt, calling it a bruised reed.
If you lean your weight on a crushed reed, it won't support you. It will simply snap and pierce your hand.
It is a brilliant metaphor for the illusion of worldly security.
We see a broader theological metaphor at play here as well. The biblical text often uses the imagery of lions to represent invading empires used by God for judgment or testing.
God allowed the Assyrian lions to cross the borders of Judah. The divine purpose behind this terrifying pressure was not to destroy Hezekiah, but to systematically strip away every false support system his nation relied upon.
God is removing the illusion that a political alliance with Egypt or a massive financial payoff to an extortionist can provide actual salvation.
He allows the pressure to increase until absolutely nothing remains but God himself.
But wait, we just spent the first half of this deep dive praising Hezekiah for his perfect, unparalleled trust, and now we find him stripping the church doors to pay off a warlord.
Yeah.
Does this ruin his legacy?
It does not ruin his legacy at all. It humanizes it.
How so?
It provides a brilliantly realistic portrait of the tension between faith and human frailty. True faith is rarely the absence of fear, and it is almost never a straight line of unbroken perfection.
Right. It's not just a steady upward graph.
True faith is defined by the overarching trajectory of the heart. Hezekiah falters. He tries to manage the crisis in his own strength, and he fails miserably.
Because the ultimate tragedy of appeasing a tyrant is that it never actually works.
You cannot bribe a bully.
Hezekiah bankrupts his nation, gives Sennacherib all this wealth, and Sennacherib simply pockets the gold and marches his army straight to Jerusalem anyway.
But when the Assyrian forces arrive at the walls of the capital, they dramatically shift their tactics.
They move from a physical siege to a masterclass in psychological demolition.
This brings us to verses 17 through 35, and the arrival of one of the most chilling figures in the Bible, the Rabshakeh.
Now, the word Rabshakeh is not a personal name, right?
Correct. It is an Assyrian military title. It translates roughly to the chief cupbearer or the supreme field commander.
So Sennacherib remains at his headquarters in Lachish, but he sends the Rabshakeh, along with the Tartan, the supreme commander, and the Rabsaris, the chief officer, accompanied by a massive army, to stand outside the walls of Jerusalem.
And the location the Rabshakeh chooses for his stand is incredibly specific.
The text notes, he stood by the conduit of the upper pool, which is in the highway of the fuller's field. Why does that specific geography matter?
Because it functions as a profound historical and theological mirror. Decades earlier, during that Syro-Ephraimite crisis we talked about, the prophet Isaiah met Hezekiah's father, King Ahaz, at that exact same water source.
Oh, wow. So Isaiah chapter 7, the prophet stood by that conduit and begged Ahaz to trust God instead of making a catastrophic alliance with Assyria.
And Ahaz stood in that spot, looked at the prophet, and chose fear over faith.
Now, a generation later, the Assyrian commander stands in the exact same footprints.
The location poses a silent, haunting question to the listener. Ahaz failed the test of faith right here. Will his son Hezekiah do the same?
The Rabshakeh stands at that historical crossroads, and he delivers a speech that is an absolute masterpiece of psychological warfare.
He doesn't just threaten them with swords, he systematically deconstructs their worldview.
His opening central question cuts to the core of human existence. What confidence is this wherein thou trustest?
The Rabshakeh operates as a mouthpiece for pure, satanic pride and intimidation. He employs tactics that modern intelligence agencies still study today.
He systematically attacks every pillar of Hezekiah's security. First, he dismantles their military strategy.
He mocks their reliance on Egypt, pointing out correctly that Pharaoh is a broken reed.
He mocks their lack of cavalry, sarcastically offering to give them 2,000 horses if they can even find enough trained riders to sit on them. He makes their physical defense look utterly pathetic.
Then, in a twist of brilliant, twisted rhetoric, he attacks Hezekiah's religious reforms.
He yells up to the defenders on the wall, "If you say you trust the Lord, isn't he the God whose high places and altars Hezekiah just tore down? Didn't Hezekiah command everyone to worship only at this one altar in Jerusalem?"
The Assyrian commander fundamentally misunderstands the theology of the Mosaic covenant.
Right, he thinks the localized high places, the pagan altars, actually belong to Yahweh.
He assumes Hezekiah insulted his own God by centralizing worship and destroying the rural shrines.
But he uses this theological ignorance to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of the average citizens.
He is trying to convince them that their king's obedience was actually a blasphemous mistake that doomed the city.
It is the oldest tactic of spiritual warfare, twisting the truth to make obedience look like a catastrophic error.
He wants the people to think, maybe Hezekiah went too far. Maybe smashing those idols made God angry.
And then the Rabshakeh takes the psychological manipulation a step further. He claims divine mandate.
In verse 25, he says, "Am I now come up without the Lord against this place to destroy it? The Lord said to me, go up against this land and destroy it."
How do you argue with an enemy who claims your own God sent him? It induces absolute cognitive dissonance.
Hezekiah's diplomats, who are standing on the wall listening to this, realize the devastating effect this speech is having on the common soldiers.
They beg the Rabshakeh to speak in Aramaic, the language of international diplomacy, rather than in Hebrew, the language of the common Judean people.
The diplomats are desperately trying to contain the psychological damage. They want to keep the negotiations classified.
But the Rabshakeh refuses. He knows exactly what he's doing.
He shouts louder in Hebrew, bypassing the political leadership to speak directly to the terrified populace.
He bypasses the firewall to send a demoralizing message directly to the troops. His goal is to incite a mutiny from within.
And then he offers them a counterfeit promise of peace.
He tells the people on the wall, "Make an agreement with me by a present and come out to me. Surrender. And then every man will eat of his own vine and every one of his fig tree, and drink the waters of his sister.
Until I come and take you away to a land like your own land, a land of corn and wine, a land of bread and vineyards."
The anatomy of a satanic temptation is laid bare in those sentences.
The Rabshakeh promises immediate, tangible comfort food, water, and relief from the agonizing siege, but he hides the true, horrific cost until the very end of his sentence.
Which is the permanent loss of their homeland, the loss of their freedom, and the loss of their covenant identity.
And notice how he attempts to normalize the trauma of deportation. He says, "I will take you to a land just like your own."
He is offering the illusion of peace at the cost of their soul. Just surrender and everything will be fine. It is a total lie.
If they open those gates, they will be slaughtered, flayed, and dragged across the desert, just like their brothers in the north.
Finally, the speech climaxes in absolute unrestrained blasphemy. The Rabshakeh equates Yahweh, the creator of the universe, with the localized, inanimate pagan gods of all the other nations Assyria has already crushed.
He lists the conquests of Assyria: Hamath, Arpad, Sepharvaim, Hena, and Iva.
He asks, where are their gods? Has any god of any nation delivered his land out of the hand of the king of Assyria?
Who are they among all the gods of the countries that have delivered their country out of mine hand, that the Lord should deliver Jerusalem out of mine hand?
He reduces the God of Israel to just another piece of wood or stone on Sennacherib's trophy shelf.
He builds a flawlessly logical, historically supported, terrifying argument for their inevitable destruction. The evidence of his victories surrounds them.
So how do you respond to that? How do you respond to a voice that perfectly targets your deepest insecurities, perfectly articulates your impending doom, and seems to possess all the visible evidence of reality on its side?
Verses 36 and 37 give us the response, and it is incredibly profound.
The response of the people is absolute silence.
But the people held their peace and answered him not a word, for the king's commandment was saying, "Answer him not."
The Judean officials, Eliakim, Shebna, and Joah, tear their clothes in grief and despair. They are emotionally devastated by the psychological assault.
But they do not utter a single word in reply.
This silence provides perhaps the most critical spiritual blueprint in the entire chapter for believers navigating a hostile world.
Sometimes the most spiritually mature and strategically effective response to mockery, to overwhelming anxiety, or to demonic intimidation is not to argue.
It is to remain completely silent and take the matter directly to a higher authority.
They refuse to give the fire oxygen. They realize that if they engage in a debate with the Rabshakeh, they lose.
The moment you start arguing with a lie that well-crafted, you legitimize the premise of the lie. You grant it standing.
By staying silent, they deny him the intellectual engagement he needs to further his manipulation.
How can you apply this kind of profound discipline in your own life today when the culture around you, or frankly, your own internal anxiety, is screaming at you to panic and defend yourself.
Psychologically and emotionally, this dynamic is incredibly relevant to how we manage information overload and the pervasive voices of despair in the modern world.
We are constantly bombarded by our own modern Rabshakehs.
It might be the relentless doom scrolling of social media predicting societal collapse.
It might be a toxic work environment actively attempting to deconstruct your values.
It might be the internal whispered voices of unworthiness, shame, and anxiety that attack your mind in the middle of the night.
The natural human instinct is to argue back. We try to frantically search for an intellectual defense. We try to rationalize our way out of the panic.
But you cannot out-argue the enemy's logic when you are locked in a cage of fear. His arguments are crafted to exploit your terror.
Spiritually, for believers in Jesus Christ, this passage is a masterclass in the biblical concept of mind renewal.
The physical siege of Jerusalem in this chapter is a perfect, tangible manifestation of an unseen spiritual reality.
The true battleground in 2 Kings 18 is not the physical limestone wall surrounding the city.
No, the ultimate battleground is the minds and the hearts of the people standing on that wall listening to the speech.
The believer is taught here that you do not negotiate with the enemy of your soul. You don't try to outwit the anxiety.
You do exactly what Hezekiah does in the very next chapter. You take the terrifying words, you walk into the presence of God, you lay the threats out on the altar, and you let the creator of the universe answer the taunt.
It is also a stark, uncompromising warning. The narrative forces you to confront the reality that the idols of cultural compromise, the clever political alliances we forge, the financial security we aggressively hoard, all of those things are totally useless against the true existential enemies of the soul.
When the Assyrian army of life finally shows up at your door, whether that is terminal illness, financial ruin, or the reality of mortality, your bank account, your career status, and your social popularity are not going to save you.
They are bruised reeds that will pierce your hand. Only the God of the covenant can intervene.
And that reality brings us full circle to Hezekiah's initial reforms at the beginning of the chapter.
If Hezekiah had not spent his early years establishing that bedrock foundation of trust, if he had not possessed the courage to smash the Asherah poles in the Nehushtan, the psychological pressure of the Rabshakeh would have broken him completely, just as the pressure of the empire broke his father Ahaz.
That is the crux of the narrative. Trusting God does not prevent the siege from happening.
Righteousness does not guarantee that the enemy will not show up at your gates shouting threats.
But the foundation of trust absolutely dictates the outcome of the siege. Because Hezekiah had cultivated that deep, abiding reliance, that batash and davak, he had a spiritual reflex that eventually caught him when his initial panic subsided.
Trusting God doesn't prevent the siege, but it dictates the outcome. We have covered an incredible, sweeping journey today.
We watched a unified nation fracture into two warring kingdoms because of one leader's arrogance.
We watched the Northern Kingdom completely dissolve into the ash heap of history because of unbroken, institutionalized rebellion against their creator.
We watched a young king rise from a traumatic, wicked household to lead a radical spiritual revival, demonstrating that our past does not dictate our future.
We watched him smash the idols of his culture and even find the courage to destroy the corrupted, nostalgic relics of his own religion.
And finally, we stood on the wall of Jerusalem and listened to the ultimate voice of intimidation, learning the profound, life-saving discipline of silence in the face of fear.
It is a chapter that continually interrogates you. It asks, where is your confidence located? When the visible, tangible structures of your life are violently shaken, what invisible foundation are you actually standing on?
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought for you to take into your week.
As you navigate your own battles, take a hard, honest look at the things you are relying on for your ultimate security.
Think back to the Nehushtan, that bronze serpent.
What perfectly good thing in your life have you secretly turned into an ultimate thing? Is it your career trajectory, your reputation, a specific relationship, a particular religious tradition, or a method of success?
What is your bronze serpent? And do you have the courage to identify it, call it a piece of brass, and smash it to pieces before the siege even begins?
Because if the foundation is fractured and the map of your life is drawn with invisible front lines, you cannot afford to have your trust placed in an inanimate object or a hollow philosophy.
So when that invisible map gets confusing and the enemy bypasses your firewall to shout intimidation over your walls,
remember the men of Judah. Hold your peace. Refuse to give the fire oxygen, and take the threat directly to the king.